The storm was ripping the barn apart, and Margaret watched in horror as the 2,000-pound horse refused to move, positioning his massive body over 3 orphaned foals while debris struck him again and again. What she found when the winds finally stopped brought her to her knees and has since moved millions around the world to tears. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The sky above the rolling farmlands of Montana had been growing darker all morning, the kind of ominous gray that made even the most seasoned ranchers stop their work and look toward the heavens with worried eyes. Margaret Holloway, a woman in her early 60s with silver hair braided down her back and hands weathered from decades of farm work, stood on the porch of her modest farmhouse and watched as the clouds churned like angry spirits gathering for war. She had lived on this land all her life, had seen countless storms come and go, but something about this one felt different. There was a weight in the air, a pressure that seemed to press against her chest with each passing minute. In the distance, thunder rumbled like the growl of some ancient beast awakening from a long slumber. Her thoughts immediately went to the pasture, where her most precious horses grazed. Among them was Atlas, a Belgian draft horse of such immense proportions that visitors to the farm often stopped in their tracks when they first laid eyes upon him. Standing at nearly 19 hands tall and weighing over 2,000 pounds, Atlas was a living monument to the power and majesty of his breed. His coat was a rich chestnut color that gleamed like burnished copper in the sunlight, and his mane, a flowing cascade of cream and gold, rippled in the wind like a banner of nobility. But it was not merely his size that made Atlas remarkable, it was his heart. A heart so vast and gentle that it seemed impossible such tenderness could reside within such an enormous frame. Atlas had come to Margaret's farm 8 years ago, rescued from an auction where he had been destined for slaughter. His previous owner, a man more interested in profit than compassion, had worked the horse nearly to death, and then discarded him when his strength began to wane. When Margaret first saw Atlas, he was thin and broken, his eyes holding the dull glaze of an animal that had lost all hope. But Margaret saw something else in those depths, something that flickered like a distant star, refusing to be extinguished. She bought him that day, brought him home, and spent months nursing him back to health. In return, Atlas had given her something she had not expected. He had given her his complete and unwavering devotion. Now, as the storm approached with terrifying speed, Margaret's concern was not only for Atlas, but for 3 small foals that had recently been born on the farm. Their mothers, 2 gentle mares named Rosie and Daisy, had tragically passed away just weeks after giving birth, due to complications that no veterinarian could prevent. The loss had devastated Margaret, but she had refused to let their orphaned foals follow them into oblivion. She had bottle-fed those babies herself, waking every few hours throughout the night to ensure they received the nourishment they needed to survive. And through it all, Atlas had watched, his great dark eyes following Margaret's every movement with an intensity that seemed almost human in its understanding. What happened next was something Margaret had never witnessed before. Atlas, as if sensing the vulnerability of those motherless foals, began to adopt them as his own. He would stand near them in the pasture, his massive body serving as a shield against the wind. When they slept, he would lower his great head and breathe warm air over their tiny forms, as if to assure them they were not alone. The foals, in turn, seemed to recognize in Atlas a protector, a guardian who would never abandon them. They would gather beneath his belly, their small bodies dwarfed by his enormity, and there, They would find peace in the shadow of his protection. The first bolt of lightning split the sky like a crack in the foundation of heaven itself, and Margaret's heart seized with fear. The storm had arrived with a fury that exceeded even her worst expectations. Rain began to fall in sheets so thick that she could barely see beyond the edge of her porch. The wind howled through the trees, bending them at angles that seemed impossible, and somewhere in the distance she heard the sharp crack of a branch surrendering to the gale. She needed to get the horses into the barn, but as she stepped off the porch, a gust of wind nearly knocked her off her feet. She was forced to retreat, her eyes straining through the rain to see the pasture where Atlas and the foals had been grazing. What she saw in that moment would stay with her for the rest of her days. Through the curtains of rain and the flashes of lightning that illuminated the darkness, she could make out the silhouette of Atlas standing in the center of the pasture. He had not sought shelter. He had not run toward the safety of the barn. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his massive body braced against the onslaught of wind and rain. And beneath him, huddled together in the space between his powerful legs, were the three foals. They pressed against each other and against the warmth of his chest, their small forms trembling but protected from the worst of the storm's wrath by the living fortress that surrounded them. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, mixing with the rain that pelted her skin. She watched as lightning struck the ground not 50 yards from where Atlas stood, the flash so bright it momentarily blinded her. The thunder that followed was deafening, a sound so powerful it seemed to shake the very earth beneath her feet. But Atlas did not move. He did not flinch. He stood like a colossus carved from stone, his only movement the steady rise and fall of his breathing and the occasional turn of his head to check on the small lives sheltered beneath him. The storm raged for what felt like hours, though in truth it was perhaps 40 minutes from its first lightning strike to its last rumble of thunder. Throughout that entire time, Atlas remained exactly where he was, serving as a living shield for those three orphaned foals. His body absorbed the full force of the wind and rain, the hail that fell like frozen bullets, the cold that would have left those small creatures shivering and vulnerable. He gave them the gift of his strength, the warmth of his body, and the protection of his presence. He asked for nothing in return. When the storm finally passed and the clouds began to part, revealing patches of blue sky and the first tentative rays of sunlight, Margaret made her way across the muddy pasture to where Atlas still stood. He turned his great head toward her as she approached, and in his eyes she saw something that transcended the barrier between species. She saw love in its purest form, love that asked no questions and placed no conditions, love that simply gave without expectation of receiving anything in return. She reached up and placed her hand against his rain-soaked neck, feeling the warmth of his body beneath her palm. The three foals emerged from beneath Atlas one by one, their small legs unsteady, but their spirits unbroken. Margaret knelt in the mud and examined each of them carefully, running her hands over their bodies to check for injuries. Miraculously, they were unharmed. A few scratches, perhaps, and certainly frightened, but alive and whole because of the sacrifice Atlas had made. She looked up at the great horse who still stood over them like a sentinel refusing to abandon his post, and she whispered words of gratitude that seemed wholly inadequate for what he had done. The foals were named Hope, Grace, and Little Courage. Hope was the eldest by 3 days, a filly with a coat the color of autumn leaves, and a white star on her forehead that looked as though it had been painted there by an artist's careful hand. Grace was smaller than her siblings, a delicate creature with legs that seemed almost too long for her body, and eyes the color of dark honey that held an intelligence beyond her young age. And then there was Courage, the smallest of the three, a colt who had nearly died during his first week of life, but had fought with a determination that earned him his name. Together, they formed a family unit as unusual as it was beautiful. Three orphans bound together by loss and united under the protection of a horse who had known his own share of suffering. In the days following the storm, word began to spread through the small community of Harlow Creek about what Atlas had done. Margaret's neighbor, an elderly man named Thomas, who had been farming the adjacent land for over 50 years, was the first to hear the story. He listened in silence as Margaret recounted what she had witnessed, his weathered face showing no expression until she finished. Then he removed his hat, held it against his chest, and said simply that, in all his years of working with horses, he had never heard of anything quite like it. He said that animals were capable of things that humans often forgot they could do, things that reminded people what truly mattered in this world. The story traveled from Thomas to his wife, from his wife to the women at the church, from the church to the general store, and from there to every corner of the small town. Within a week, people began arriving at Margaret's farm, not to gawk or to satisfy idle curiosity, but to see with their own eyes the horse who had stood against the storm to protect three orphaned foals. They came bearing gifts of hay and oats, of blankets and medicine, of all the things that Margaret needed but had been too proud to ask for. They came because the story of Atlas had touched something deep within them, had reminded them of the capacity for love and sacrifice that existed not only in humans, but in all living creatures. Among the visitors was a young woman named Elena, a veterinarian who had recently moved to Harlow Creek from the city. She had heard the story and had dismissed it at first as the kind of exaggeration that small towns were prone to producing. But something about the way people spoke of Atlas, the reverence in their voices, and the moisture in their eyes, had compelled her to see for herself. When she arrived at Margaret's farm and saw Atlas standing in the pasture with the three foals gathered around him, she understood immediately that the story had not been exaggerated at all. If anything, it had failed to capture the full magnitude of what stood before her. Elena spent hours at the farm that first day, examining Atlas and the foals, asking Margaret questions about their history and their care. She learned about Atlas's rescue from the auction, about the months Margaret had spent nursing him back to health, about the bond that had formed between the great horse and the orphaned babies. She learned that Atlas had never been trained to be a guardian, had never been taught to protect, had simply chosen to do so because something within him recognized that those small lives needed him. And as she listened, Elena felt her professional skepticism melting away, replaced by a sense of wonder that she had not experienced since she was a child. The foals themselves seemed to sense the change that had come over their small world. They had grown accustomed to Atlas's presence, to the safety of standing beneath his massive frame, to the warmth of his body on cold mornings. But now there were other humans entering their lives, strangers who approached with gentle hands and soft voices, who brought treats and affection and the kind of attention that young animals craved. Hope, ever the boldest of the three, was the first to approach the visitors, her curiosity overcoming her caution as she stretched her neck to sniff their outstretched hands. Grace remained more reserved, watching from a distance with those intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything and understand more than anyone expected. And Courage, the smallest and the weakest, stayed close to Atlas, as if afraid that venturing too far from his protector might invite disaster. Margaret watched all of this unfold with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. She was grateful for the support of her community, for the supplies and the help, and the recognition that Atlas deserved. But she was also wary of the attention, worried that it might somehow disturb the delicate balance that had been established on her farm. She had seen what happened when animals became objects of fascination, how quickly admiration could turn into exploitation, how easily good intentions could pave the road to harm. She vowed to herself that she would protect Atlas and the foals from that fate, that she would guard them as fiercely as Atlas had guarded those babies during the storm. As summer faded into autumn, and autumn surrendered to the first whispers of winter, the foals continued to grow under Atlas's watchful care. They learned to run and play, to explore the boundaries of their pasture, to test their limits while always remaining within the orbit of their enormous guardian. Atlas, for his part, seemed to take on his role with a solemnity that bordered on the sacred. He was patient with their antics, tolerant of their mischief, and ever vigilant against any threat that might approach. When hawks circled overhead, he would position himself between them and the foals. When strange dogs wandered too close to the fence, he would stamp his massive hooves and snort warnings that sent them fleeing. The bond between Atlas and his adopted family grew stronger with each passing day, a testament to the power of love to transcend the boundaries of blood and birth. Winter arrived with a ferocity that caught even the most experienced farmers off guard. The first snowfall came in early November, blanketing the landscape in white, and transforming the familiar contours of Margaret's farm into something almost unrecognizable. The temperature plummeted, and the wind that swept across the open fields carried a bite that seemed to cut through even the thickest clothing. Margaret worked from dawn until well past dusk, preparing her animals for the harsh months ahead, reinforcing the barn, stockpiling hay, and checking every fence for weaknesses that the winter storms might exploit. Atlas and the foals had been moved to the larger of the two barns, a structure that Margaret's grandfather had built nearly a century ago with his own hands. The walls were thick and solid, the roof recently repaired, and the interior was divided into spacious stalls that provided each animal with room to move, while still offering the warmth of close quarters. But Atlas, despite the comfort of his surroundings, seemed restless in those first days of confinement. He would pace the length of his stall, his great hooves echoing against the wooden floor, his eyes constantly searching for the foals, as if afraid they might disappear the moment he looked away. Margaret understood his anxiety. She had seen it before in animals that had suffered loss, that had known the pain of abandonment or neglect. Atlas had found purpose in protecting those three small lives, and being separated from them, even by the walls of adjacent stalls, triggered something deep within him that demanded vigilance. After watching him pace for 3 consecutive nights, Margaret made a decision that her neighbors would later call either brilliant or foolish, depending on their perspective. She removed the partitions between the stalls, creating one enormous space where Atlas and the foals could remain together. The change was immediate and profound. Atlas calmed the moment the barriers came down, positioning himself in the center of the expanded area, while hope, grace, and courage gathered around him. They slept in a pile of warmth and contentment. The foals nestled against Atlas's belly and flanks, their small bodies rising and falling with the rhythm of peaceful dreams. Margaret would often find herself standing at the barn door in the early morning hours, watching them sleep, marveling at the family they had become, despite every biological and circumstantial reason why they should not have been a family at all. The foals were growing rapidly now, their bodies filling out with the good food and careful attention they received. Hope had developed a personality that could only be described as mischievous, constantly testing boundaries and exploring every corner of her environment with fearless curiosity. She had learned to unlatch the feed bin with her teeth, a skill that had resulted in more than one unauthorized midnight snack before Margaret discovered and secured it with a more complex mechanism. Grace remained the thoughtful one, always observing, always calculating, her movements deliberate, and her decisions careful. She seemed to understand things that the others did not, responding to Margaret's moods with an empathy that was almost unsettling in its accuracy. And then there was Courage, who had grown stronger with each passing week, but still bore the marks of his difficult start in life. He was smaller than his siblings, his legs slightly crooked from the illness that had nearly claimed him, his coat lacking the luster that Hope and Grace displayed. But what Courage lacked in physical perfection, he more than made up for in spirit. He approached every day as if it were a gift, throwing himself into play with an abandon that made Margaret laugh and sometimes brought tears to her eyes. He had survived against all odds, and he seemed determined to make every moment of that survival count. Elena, the veterinarian, had become a regular presence at the farm. What had begun as professional curiosity had evolved into something deeper, a genuine affection for Margaret and her unusual family of horses. She came by every few days to check on the foals, to monitor their growth and development, and to spend time with Atlas, who had taken to her with a trust that he showed few other strangers. Elena would stand beside him in the barn, her hand resting against his massive shoulder, speaking to him in the low, soothing tones that horses seemed to find comforting. And Atlas would lower his great head, his breath warm against her hair, accepting her presence as he had accepted the foals into his care. It was during one of these visits that Elena first noticed something troubling. She was examining Atlas's front legs, running her hands down the powerful columns of muscle and bone, when she felt a slight swelling just above his left hoof. It was subtle, easy to miss if one was not looking for it, but Elena's trained fingers detected it immediately. She said nothing at first, not wanting to alarm Margaret until she had more information, but the furrow in her brow betrayed her concern. She asked Margaret if Atlas had been favoring that leg, if she had noticed any change in his gait or reluctance to move. Margaret thought for a moment and then admitted that he had seemed slower lately, less eager to walk to the far end of the barn, more inclined to remain stationary while the foals played around him. Elena promised to return the following day with equipment for a more thorough examination. That night, Margaret lay awake in her bed, listening to the wind howl outside her window and thinking about all the things that could go wrong. Atlas was not a young horse. The years of hard labor before his rescue had taken a toll on his body, and the strain of carrying his immense weight day after day placed demands on his joints and tendons that lighter horses never faced. She had always known that his time with her would be limited, that the very size that made him magnificent also made him vulnerable to the physical breakdowns that plagued the largest breeds. But knowing something intellectually and confronting its reality were two very different experiences. She rose before dawn the next morning and made her way to the barn through snow that reached her knees. The world was silent and white, the kind of stillness that only winter can bring, and her breath formed clouds in the frigid air as she walked. When she reached the barn and pushed open the heavy door, she found Atlas exactly where she had left him, standing in the center of the space with the three foals sleeping peacefully at his feet. Elena arrived shortly after sunrise, her truck cutting fresh tracks through the snow that had accumulated overnight. She carried a case of medical equipment and wore an expression that Margaret recognized immediately as professional concern, carefully masked by practiced calm. Together, they made their way to the barn, their boots crunching through the frozen crust that had formed over the softer snow beneath. The foals stirred at the sound of their approach, lifting their heads with the alertness of youth before recognizing the familiar figures, and settling back into drowsiness. Atlas, however, did not move. He stood as he always stood, a monument of patience and devotion, his eyes tracking the women as they entered his domain. The examination took nearly an hour. Elena worked methodically, her hands moving over Atlas with the expertise born of years of training and practice. She checked his legs, his hooves, his joints, pressing and probing with gentle but firm fingers, while Atlas stood cooperatively, occasionally turning his head to watch her work, as if curious about her findings. Margaret stood nearby, her arms crossed over her chest, her heart beating with an anxiety that she struggled to conceal. She had learned long ago that animals could sense fear and worry in humans, and she did not want to add to whatever burden Atlas might already be carrying. When Elena finally straightened and stepped back, her face held an expression that Margaret had dreaded seeing. She spoke in measured tones, explaining that Atlas was suffering from a condition that affected many draft horses of his size and age. The years of labor had damaged the tendons in his lower legs, and the swelling she had detected was evidence of inflammation that had likely been building for months. It was not immediately life-threatening, she assured Margaret, but it was also not something that could be cured. The best they could hope for was management, reducing his activity, providing medication to control the pain, and accepting that his mobility would gradually decline over time. Margaret listened to every word, her face betraying nothing of the storm that raged within her. When Elena finished speaking, Margaret asked the only question that truly mattered to her. She asked how much time Atlas had left. Elena hesitated before answering, clearly reluctant to make predictions that medicine could not guarantee. But she understood that Margaret needed something to hold on to, some framework within which to plan and prepare. She said that with proper care, Atlas could live comfortably for another 2 or 3 years, perhaps longer if they were fortunate. But she also warned that his condition could deteriorate more rapidly, that there was no way to know for certain how his body would respond to the treatments she was proposing. The news settled over Margaret like a weight she had not anticipated. She had known, in the abstract way that all animal lovers know, that the creatures they cared for would not live forever. But abstract knowledge offered no preparation for the concrete reality of watching someone you loved begin the slow decline toward an end you could not prevent. She thanked Elena for her honesty, accepted the medications and instructions she provided, and walked her to her truck with a composure that crumbled the moment the vehicle disappeared down the snow-covered road. She wept then, standing alone in the cold, her tears freezing on her cheeks almost as quickly as they fell. She wept for Atlas, for the suffering he had already endured, and the suffering that lay ahead. She wept for the Foals, who would eventually lose the guardian who had given them everything. And she wept for herself, for the love she had invested in a creature whose time with her was now measured not in decades but in seasons. The grief was overwhelming, a flood that threatened to sweep away every anchor she had built over the years of her solitary life on this farm. But Margaret Holloway was not a woman who surrendered easily to despair. She had buried a husband, had weathered financial ruin, had survived losses that would have broken spirits less resilient than hers. And so, after allowing herself those moments of raw emotion, she dried her eyes and returned to the barn with a determination that had defined her entire existence. She would give Atlas the best remaining years of his life. She would ensure that every day he had left was filled with comfort and love, and the presence of the Foals who had become his reason for living. She would not waste a single moment mourning a future that had not yet arrived. The Foals seemed to sense that something had changed, though they could not have understood its nature. Hope approached Margaret with unusual gentleness, nuzzling her hand and making soft sounds that seemed almost like questions. Grace watched from a distance, her intelligent eyes tracking Margaret's movements, with an intensity that suggested she was cataloging every detail for later analysis. And courage, sweet, stubborn courage, walked directly to Atlas and pressed his small body against the great horse's leg, as if offering comfort to the creature who had so often comforted him. Atlas lowered his enormous head and breathed warm air over the little colt, his eyes half closing in an expression of contentment that transcended whatever pain he might have been feeling. In that moment, Margaret understood something that she had perhaps always known but had never articulated. Love was not diminished by its temporary nature. If anything, it was made more precious by the knowledge that it would not last forever. Every touch, every breath, every shared moment became a treasure to be cherished rather than a commonplace to be taken for granted. She began implementing Elena's recommendations that very day. She adjusted Atlas's feed, adding supplements designed to support joint health and reduce inflammation. She created a soft bed of straw thick enough to cushion his massive weight when he lay down to rest. She arranged for the foals to have access to a separate area during the day, allowing Atlas periods of rest without the constant demand of supervising his energetic charges. But she also made certain that they were reunited every evening, that the family she had witnessed forming over these past months remained intact, despite the challenges they faced. Winter deepened around them, the shortest days of the year bringing darkness that seemed to last forever and cold, that tested the limits of both human and animal endurance. Christmas came to Harlow Creek with a quietness that matched the snow-muffled landscape. The town decorated its single main street with lights that twinkled bravely against the darkness, and the church held its annual candlelight service that drew even those residents who rarely attended throughout the year. Margaret participated in none of these festivities. She had never been one for holidays, finding them more melancholy than joyful since her husband's passing nearly 15 years ago. But this year, she found herself creating small celebrations of her own, marking the season not with tinsel and carols, but with extra treats for Atlas and the foals, with warm blankets and longer visits to the barn, with the simple rituals of care that had become the foundation of her daily existence. The foals had never experienced snow before their first winter, and their reactions to the white world outside the barn provided Margaret with endless entertainment. Hope was the first to venture out into a freshly fallen accumulation, her hooves sinking into the powder with each step, her expression shifting from confusion to delight as she discovered the joy of prancing through the drifts. Grace approached the snow with her characteristic caution, testing it carefully before committing her weight, analyzing its properties with the serious attention of a scientist conducting an important experiment. Courage simply threw himself into it with complete abandon, rolling and kicking and emerging, covered in white crystals that clung to his dark coat like scattered stars. Atlas watched these adventures from the doorway of the barn, his massive frame silhouetted against the interior warmth. He no longer joined the foals in their outdoor excursions, his compromised legs making the uneven footing too risky for his enormous weight. But he seemed content to observe, his eyes following their movements with the patient attention of a parent supervising children at play. When they returned to him, shaking off snow and seeking warmth, he would lower his head and breathe over them, his breath creating small clouds in the cold air, his presence assuring them that home was wherever he stood. Elena continued her regular visits, monitoring Atlas's condition and adjusting his treatment as needed. The medications seemed to be helping, reducing the swelling in his legs and easing the discomfort that had made his movements increasingly labored. But Elena warned Margaret not to mistake improvement for recovery. The underlying damage remained, would always remain, and the best they could do was slow the progression and manage the symptoms. Margaret accepted this truth with the stoicism that had become her default response to bad news. She had learned long ago that fighting against reality accomplished nothing except exhaustion. The winter days developed their own rhythm, a pattern of routines that provided structure and purpose to what might otherwise have been an endless stretch of cold and darkness. Margaret rose before dawn to feed the horses, breaking the ice that formed on their water troughs, and distributing hay that steamed in the frigid air. She spent the middle hours of the day tending to household tasks, repairing equipment, and planning for the spring that seemed impossibly distant. And she ended each evening in the barn, sitting on an overturned bucket, while Atlas and the foals settled into sleep around her, the only sounds their breathing and the occasional creak of the old building shifting against the wind. It was during one of these evening vigils that Margaret first noticed the change in Courage. The smallest of the foals had always been different from his siblings, marked by the struggles of his early life in ways both visible and invisible. But lately, he had seemed more withdrawn, spending longer periods standing alone rather than playing with hope and grace. His appetite diminished, and his energy levels lower than they had been even weeks before. Margaret mentioned her observations to Elena during her next visit, and the veterinarian's examination confirmed what Margaret had feared. Courage was not thriving the way his siblings were. His heart, weakened by the illness that had nearly killed him as a newborn, was not keeping pace with the demands of his growing body. The diagnosis was another blow, another reminder of the fragility that lurked beneath the surface of every life. Elena explained the options, which were limited, and offered no guarantees. Medication could support his heart function, might buy him time, but could not repair the damage that had already been done. He might live for years, she said, or he might decline rapidly. There was simply no way to predict how his body would respond. Margaret listened with the numbness that had become familiar, the protective shell that allowed her to absorb terrible news without collapsing under its weight. She agreed to the treatment plan, accepted the additional medications and instructions, and watched Elena drive away with the same hollow feeling she had experienced after Atlas's diagnosis. That night, Margaret sat in the barn longer than usual, her eyes fixed on Courage, as he slept pressed against Atlas's side. The great horse seemed to sense her distress, turning his head to look at her with those deep, knowing eyes that had always seemed to understand more than any animal should. She spoke to him then, her voice low and steady, telling him things she had never said aloud to any living creature. She told him about her husband, about the cancer that had taken him piece by piece, until nothing remained but a shell of the man she had loved. She told him about the years of loneliness that followed, the way she had poured herself into the farm because it was easier than confronting the emptiness that waited in her silent house. She told him about the fear that gripped her heart when she thought about losing him, about losing Courage, about being left alone again in a world that seemed determined to take everything she loved. Atlas listened without moving, his breath slow and steady, his presence a comfort that required no words. And when Margaret finally fell silent, exhausted by the outpouring of emotion she had kept locked away for so long, he lowered his enormous head and rested it gently against her shoulder. The weight of him, the warmth of him, the simple fact of his existence in that moment gave Margaret something she had not known she needed. It gave her permission to be weak, to be afraid, to be human in all the ways she had denied herself for so many years. She wrapped her arms around his great neck and held on, as if he were the only solid thing in the world that had become uncertain and treacherous beneath her feet. Spring arrived slowly, reluctantly, as if winter were unwilling to release its grip on the land. The snow began to melt in patches, revealing the brown earth beneath like wounds healing after a long illness. The days grew longer, the light lingering a few minutes more each evening, and the bitter cold that had defined the past months gradually softened into something more bearable. Margaret watched the changing season with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She had survived another winter, and so had her horses, but she knew that the challenges ahead would not be diminished simply because the temperature had risen. Courage had responded better to the medication than anyone had dared to hope. His energy levels had improved, and while he remained smaller than his siblings, he had regained the spark that had always defined his spirit. He played with hope and grace again, chasing them around the pasture with a determination that refused to acknowledge his physical limitations. Margaret allowed herself to feel cautiously optimistic, to believe that perhaps she had been granted more time with this brave little colt than the initial prognosis had suggested. She knew better than to trust optimism completely, but she also knew that hope was sometimes the only thing that kept a person moving forward. Atlas, too, seemed revitalized by the warmer weather. The stiffness that had plagued his movements during the coldest months eased somewhat, and he began taking short walks around the pasture again, always with the foals close by his side. His condition had not improved in any fundamental way, Elena reminded Margaret during her visits, but the reduced inflammation and the gentler temperatures had given him a reprieve. He moved with more confidence, stood with less apparent discomfort, and engaged with the foals with an attentiveness that had been diminished during the darkest weeks of winter. The story of Atlas and the foals had continued to spread beyond the boundaries of Harlow Creek. A reporter from the regional newspaper had heard about them and arrived one afternoon to interview Margaret and take photographs. She was reluctant at first, wary of the attention and protective of the privacy that she and her horses had enjoyed. But the reporter was respectful and genuine in her interest, and Margaret eventually agreed to share their story. The article appeared the following week, accompanied by photographs that captured Atlas standing guard over the three foals, his massive body framed against the pastoral backdrop of Margaret's farm. The headline read simply, "A Giant's Heart," and the story beneath it recounted the storm, the rescue, the bond that had formed, and the challenges they now faced. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Letters began arriving at Margaret's mailbox, dozens at first and then hundreds, from people across the country who had been moved by the story. Some contained donations to help with Atlas's medical care. Others offered words of encouragement and prayers for his continued health. Many shared their own stories of animals who had touched their lives, of bonds that had formed in unexpected ways, of love that transcended the boundaries between species. Margaret spent hours reading these letters, humbled by the connection that Atlas had inspired among strangers who would never meet him, but who had nonetheless been changed by knowing he existed. Among the letters was one that stood out from the rest. It came from a woman named Sarah, who lived several states away, and who had read the article while sitting in a hospital waiting room. Her daughter, she explained, was undergoing treatment for a serious illness, and the story of Atlas had provided a moment of light in what had been an unrelenting darkness. She wrote that her daughter had asked to see pictures of Atlas every day, that she had begun calling him her guardian angel, and that the knowledge of his existence had given her something to hold on to during her most difficult moments. Sarah asked if it would be possible to bring her daughter to meet Atlas, acknowledging that the request was presumptuous and that she would understand completely if Margaret declined. Margaret read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down her face by the final reading. She thought about the power of connection, about the way a single act of love could ripple outward and touch lives that one would never know. She thought about Atlas, who had no idea that his devotion to 3 orphaned foals had become a source of hope for a sick child hundreds of miles away. And she thought about her own resistance to the attention that had come to her farm, her instinct to protect and isolate, and whether that instinct was serving anyone's interests but her own. She wrote back to Sarah that same day, inviting her and her daughter to visit whenever they were able to make the journey. She warned that Atlas was not in perfect health, that his condition made it uncertain how long he would be able to receive visitors, but that as long as he was standing, he would welcome anyone who needed the comfort his presence could provide. She sealed the letter with a feeling that she had done something important, something that extended the circle of Atlas's influence beyond the boundaries of her small farm and into a world that desperately needed the kind of love he represented. The foals continued to grow as spring advanced into early summer. Hope had become a striking young horse, her coat gleaming with health, and her movements displaying the grace that would one day make her a beautiful adult. Grace had developed into a thoughtful and observant animal, always watching, always learning, her intelligence manifesting in behaviors that sometimes surprised even Margaret with their sophistication. And courage, dear courage, had defied every pessimistic prediction, growing stronger each day, his spirit undiminished by the physical challenges he faced. He would never be as large or as robust as his siblings, but he had carved out his own place in the world through sheer force of will. Atlas watched over all of them with the same unwavering devotion he had shown since the day of the storm. His body might be failing, his legs might ache with every step, but his heart remained as vast and generous as it had ever been. He was the center around which their small family revolved, the anchor that held them steady against whatever winds might blow. And winds were coming, Margaret knew. They were always coming. But for now, in this moment of peace and connection, she allowed herself to simply be grateful for what they had. Sarah and her daughter arrived on a morning in late June, when the sun was warm but not yet oppressive, and the fields surrounding Margaret's farm were alive with the buzzing of insects and the songs of birds. The daughter's name was Lily, and she was 8 years old, though illness had given her eyes a depth that belonged to someone far older. She was small for her age, her body made fragile by the treatments that were fighting to save her life, and she moved with a careful deliberation that suggested every step required conscious effort. But when she saw Atlas for the first time, standing in the pasture with the foals gathered around him, something in her face transformed. The weariness lifted, replaced by a wonder so pure and unguarded that Margaret felt her heart constrict with emotion. They approached the fence slowly, Sarah holding Lily's hand with the protective grip of a mother who had learned that the world could be cruel in ways she had never imagined. Margaret walked beside them, explaining in quiet tones that Atlas was gentle but enormous, that he would not hurt her, but that she should move calmly to avoid startling him. Lily nodded without taking her eyes off the great horse, her gaze fixed on him as if he were the most magnificent thing she had ever seen. And perhaps, Margaret thought, he was. Perhaps there was something about encountering true majesty that made all the small disappointments and terrors of life seem momentarily insignificant. Atlas noticed their approach and turned his massive head toward them. For a long moment, he simply looked at Lily, his dark eyes meeting hers across the distance that separated them. Then, slowly and deliberately, he began walking toward the fence. His gait was still affected by his condition, each step requiring effort that would have been invisible to anyone who did not know to look for it. But he moved with a purpose that suggested he understood something important was happening. The foals followed him, curious about these new visitors, their young bodies full of the energy that Atlas himself had once possessed. When Atlas reached the fence, He lowered his enormous head until it was level with Lily's face. The child stood frozen, her eyes wide, her breath coming in small gasps that might have been fear or might have been something else entirely. Sarah tensed beside her, ready to pull her daughter back at the first sign of danger. But Margaret placed a gentle hand on her arm and shook her head. She had seen Atlas with children before, had witnessed the extraordinary care he took around the small and the vulnerable. He would not harm this girl. Of that, Margaret was absolutely certain. Lily raised her hand, trembling slightly, and placed it against Atlas's muzzle. The great horse closed his eyes at her touch, his breath warm and steady against her palm, his stillness a gift of patience that seemed almost impossible for a creature of his size. Lily began to cry then, silent tears that rolled down her cheeks and dropped onto the ground below, and her mother cried with her, and Margaret turned away to wipe her own eyes because some moments were too sacred to observe directly. They stayed for 3 hours, that first visit. Lily sat on an overturned bucket in the pasture, surrounded by the foals who seemed to sense her fragility and treated her with unusual gentleness. Hope approached first, sniffing her hair and her clothes with curious interest before allowing the child to stroke her neck. Grace watched from a distance, her intelligent eyes assessing the situation before she too moved closer, standing beside Lily like a silent guardian. And Courage, brave little Courage, settled himself directly at her feet and rested his head in her lap, his eyes half closed with contentment, his warmth seeping into her thin body like a blessing. Atlas stood over all of them, his presence a canopy of protection that encompassed not just his adopted foals, but this small human child who had traveled so far to meet him. He did not move from that spot for the entire visit, did not seek food or water or rest, simply stood and watched and breathed, his existence a testament to the power of devoted love. Sarah sat beside Margaret on the fence, watching her daughter laugh for the first time in months, and she whispered words of gratitude that seemed wholly inadequate for the gift they had received. When it was time to leave, Lily did not want to go. She clung to Courage, her thin arms wrapped around his neck, her face buried in his mane, her body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deep within her. Sarah knelt beside her and spoke softly, promising that they could return, that this was not goodbye forever, that Atlas and the foals would be waiting for her whenever she was able to come back. Eventually, with great reluctance, Lily released her hold and allowed her mother to lead her away. But at the gate, she turned and looked back at Atlas one final time, and she raised her hand in a wave that the great horse seemed to acknowledge, with a slow blink of his ancient eyes. After they left, Margaret sat alone in the pasture for a long time, thinking about what she had witnessed. She thought about the connections that form between beings, the invisible threads that link one heart to another across distances of space and species and circumstance. She thought about Lily, fighting a battle that no child should have to fight, finding comfort in the presence of a horse she had only just met. She thought about Atlas, who had been discarded and abandoned, who had been deemed worthless by a man who saw value only in terms of labor and profit, and who had become a source of hope for strangers who would never know the full extent of his journey. The foals gathered around her as the afternoon faded into evening, their bodies warm against hers, their breath soft and rhythmic. Atlas stood nearby, his silhouette dark against the golden light of the setting sun, his presence a comfort that required no words. Margaret reached up and touched his leg, feeling the strength that still remained in those massive muscles, the life that still flowed through those compromised tendons. He was not finished yet. None of them were finished yet. There was still time, still love, still moments to be shared and treasured and remembered. She rose and walked toward the barn, the foals following behind her, Atlas bringing up the rear with his slow, steady gait. Summer reached its peak in a blaze of heat and light that transformed the landscape into a golden tapestry of ripening fields and cloudless skies. The days stretched long and warm, and Margaret found herself falling into a rhythm that felt almost peaceful, despite the undercurrents of worry that never entirely left her mind. She had learned to live with uncertainty, to hold hope and fear in the same hand, without letting either one dominate. It was not an easy balance, but it was the only way she knew to continue forward. Lily returned 3 more times that summer, each visit lasting longer than the one before. Her treatments had shown promising results, Sarah reported with cautious optimism, and the doctors were encouraged by her response. But it was the visits to the farm that seemed to affect Lily most profoundly. She spoke of Atlas constantly, drew pictures of him that covered the walls of her hospital room, and counted the days between visits, with an anticipation that gave her something to look forward to beyond the next round of medication. The connection between the child and the horse had become something neither Margaret nor Sarah fully understood, but both recognized as significant. During her visits, Lily would spend hours in the pasture with the foals, her laughter ringing across the fields like music that had been absent from Margaret's farm for too long. She had formed a particular bond with Courage, the two of them seeming to recognize in each other a shared experience of struggle and survival. They would sit together in the grass, Lily's small hand resting on Courage's neck, both of them quiet and content in a way that suggested their communication transcended the need for words. Margaret watched these moments with a tenderness that surprised her, feeling as though she were witnessing something sacred, something that existed outside the ordinary boundaries of human and animal interaction. Atlas presided over these gatherings with his characteristic patience, his enormous presence a constant backdrop against which the smaller dramas of foals and children played out. His condition had stabilized somewhat during the warmer months, the heat seeming to ease the stiffness in his joints and allow for greater mobility than he had enjoyed during the winter. But Margaret knew better than to mistake stability for improvement. The underlying damage remained, and each day that passed brought him closer to the inevitable decline that Elena had warned her about. She treasured the good days precisely because she understood how numbered they were. The foals had grown substantially over the summer months, their bodies filling out with muscle and their movements gaining the confidence of young horses approaching adolescence. Hope had developed into a spirited creature, full of energy and mischief, her copper coat gleaming like polished metal in the sunlight. She had begun testing boundaries in ways that required Margaret to reinforce fences and secure gates, her intelligence manifesting in an ability to find weaknesses that other horses would never notice. Grace remained the contemplative one, observing everything with those deep, thoughtful eyes, her movements deliberate and her decisions careful. She seemed to understand the fragility of their situation in ways that the more carefree Hope did not. And Courage, despite his limitations, had found his own path to thriving. He would never be as large or as strong as his siblings, but he had developed a resilience that compensated for his physical shortcomings. His heart, while compromised, continued to beat with a determination that defied medical expectations. Elena attributed his improvement to a combination of medication, careful management, and something less quantifiable that she could only describe as spirit. Whatever the cause, Courage had become living proof that survival was possible even when the odds were stacked against you. The summer also brought visitors beyond Lily and Sarah. Word of Atlas had continued to spread, and people arrived at Margaret's farm seeking something they could not quite articulate. Some were dealing with their own losses, their own struggles, their own dark nights of the soul. They came hoping that the presence of the great horse might provide comfort or inspiration, or simply a moment of peace in lives that had become turbulent. Margaret welcomed them all, understanding that Atlas had become something larger than himself, a symbol of love and devotion that resonated with anyone who had ever cared deeply for another being. One afternoon in late August, a man arrived alone. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and a face lined by years of what Margaret guessed had been difficult experiences. He introduced himself as Robert and explained that he had driven nearly 400 miles to see Atlas. His wife had passed away the previous year, he said, after a long illness, during which he had cared for her with the same unwavering devotion that Atlas showed the foals. Reading about the horse had given him a sense of connection, a feeling that somewhere in the world there existed a love as complete as the one he had shared with his wife. He needed to witness it in person, he said, to remind himself that such love was real. Margaret led Robert to the pasture, where Atlas stood in his customary position with the foals nearby. The man approached the fence and simply stood there for a long time, his eyes fixed on the great horse, his expression unreadable. Atlas eventually noticed him and walked slowly toward the fence, his movements careful and deliberate. When he reached Robert, he lowered his head and stood quietly, his breath warm and steady, his presence offering whatever comfort it could to this stranger who had traveled so far to find him. Robert reached out and placed his hand on Atlas's muzzle, and Margaret saw his shoulders begin to shake. He wept silently, his grief finally finding an outlet in the presence of a creature who asked nothing and judged nothing, and simply existed as a testament to the power of devoted love. Margaret turned away, giving him privacy, understanding that some moments of healing could only happen when witnessed by those who would not speak of them afterward. When Robert finally composed himself and turned to leave, he pressed an envelope into Margaret's hand. Inside was a check for an amount that made her gasp, more money than she had seen in years. He told her to use it for Atlas, for the foals, for whatever they needed. Then he walked to his car and drove away without looking back, leaving Margaret standing in the afternoon light, with tears in her own eyes. Autumn arrived with a swiftness that caught Margaret off guard, the green leaves transforming, seemingly overnight, into brilliant shades of orange and red and gold. The air grew crisp, carrying the scent of fallen apples and decaying vegetation, and the days shortened with an urgency that seemed to mirror the changes happening within her small family of horses. Atlas had begun to slow again, his movements growing more labored as the cooler temperatures settled into his aging joints. Elena's visits became more frequent, her examinations more thorough, her expression more carefully guarded with each passing week. The foals, now approaching their first birthday, had become young horses in their own right. They no longer fit beneath Atlas's belly as they had during that terrible storm, their bodies too large and their legs too long for the shelter he had once provided. But they remained close to him always, as if they understood that their time together was measured in ways that transcended the simple passage of days. Hope had tempered her wildness somewhat, spending more hours standing quietly beside Atlas than racing across the pasture as she once had. Grace watched everything with her knowing eyes, her behavior suggesting an awareness of mortality that horses should not possess. And Courage, brave little Courage, refused to leave Atlas's side at all, sleeping pressed against him each night, waking beside him each morning, his devotion a mirror of the devotion that had saved his life. Margaret received word from Sarah in early October that Lily's treatments had been successful. The disease that had threatened to claim her young life had gone into remission, and the doctors were optimistic about her long-term prognosis. Sarah's letter was filled with gratitude, not just for the medical care her daughter had received, but for the hope that Atlas had provided during their darkest hours. Lily spoke of the great horse every day, Sarah wrote, and the drawings that covered her walls had been replaced by photographs from their visits. Images that Lily treasured more than any toy or gift she had ever received. They planned to visit again before winter, Sarah promised, to thank Atlas in person for the gift he had given them. But winter was coming faster than anyone anticipated. The weather forecasters spoke of an unusual pattern developing, a collision of systems that would bring conditions more severe than anything the region had experienced in decades. Margaret listened to these reports with growing concern, her mind immediately going to the barn and the creatures within it. She had weathered countless storms on this farm, had learned to read the sky and the wind and the behavior of animals who sensed changes that humans could not perceive. And everything she observed told her that something significant was approaching. The storm arrived on the night before Lily and Sarah were scheduled to visit. Margaret had spent the day preparing, securing loose equipment, stockpiling supplies, ensuring that the barn was as weatherproof as she could make it. Atlas had been restless all day, pacing the limited area his condition allowed, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if he could see the danger approaching. The foals stayed close to him, their usual playfulness replaced by a tension that reflected their guardian's unease. When the first drops of rain began to fall, Margaret made the decision to remain in the barn with them, unwilling to leave them alone during whatever was coming. The storm that descended upon the farm that night was unlike anything Margaret had experienced in all her years on the land. The wind screamed through the valley with a fury that seemed almost personal, tearing at the barn walls and testing every joint and nail that held the structure together. Rain fell in torrents so thick that visibility was reduced to nothing, and lightning split the sky with a frequency that turned night into a flickering approximation of day. Thunder rolled continuously, a drumbeat of destruction that seemed to shake the very foundation of the earth. Inside the barn, Margaret huddled with her horses, speaking to them in low, calm tones that belied the terror she felt in her heart. Hope pressed against her on one side, Grace on the other, their bodies trembling with fear, despite her attempts to comfort them. Courage had positioned himself directly beneath Atlas, returning to the shelter he had known as a newborn, seeking safety in the shadow of the giant who had always protected him. And Atlas stood firm, his massive body braced against the chaos, his eyes alert, despite the fear that must have coursed through his ancient veins. Then came the sound that Margaret would never forget, a crack so loud and sharp that it cut through even the roar of the storm. She looked up in time to see a section of the barn roof beginning to tear away, the wind finding purchase in a weakness that decades of repairs had failed to fully address. The opening widened with terrifying speed, rain pouring through in sheets, debris flying through the air like missiles seeking targets. Margaret screamed, throwing herself over Hope and Grace, knowing even as she did so that she could not protect them from what was happening. What occurred next seemed to unfold in slow motion, each second stretching into an eternity that burned itself into Margaret's memory. Atlas moved with a speed and purpose that should have been impossible given his condition, his massive body positioning itself between the falling debris and the creatures he had sworn to protect. A beam came down, heavy and sharp, and Atlas took its impact on his shoulder and back, his legs buckling momentarily before he forced them straight again. Another piece of roofing flew toward Courage, and Atlas shifted to block it, the material striking his flank with a sound that made Margaret cry out in anguish. The storm raged for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 30 minutes. When it finally passed, leaving behind a silence that seemed almost sacred in its completeness, Margaret raised her head and surveyed the destruction. Half the barn roof was gone, scattered across the fields in pieces that would take weeks to collect. Water stood inches deep on the floor, and the cold night air poured through the opening above. But the foals were unharmed. All three of them stood trembling but whole, protected by the body that had shielded them from the worst of the storm's fury. Atlas lay on the ground, his breathing labored, his great body finally surrendering to the injuries he had sustained in defense of those he loved. Margaret scrambled across the waterlogged floor to reach Atlas, her knees sinking into the sodden straw as she collapsed beside his enormous head. His eyes were open, watching her approach with an expression that held no fear, only a profound weariness that seemed to emanate from somewhere deeper than physical exhaustion. She placed her hands on his neck, feeling the warmth of his body, the slow but steady rhythm of his heart, and she wept with a relief so overwhelming that it threatened to consume her entirely. He was alive, against all odds, against every law of probability and nature. He was still alive. Elena arrived within the hour, having driven through roads that were barely passable, her determination to reach the farm overriding any concern for her own safety. She examined Atlas with hands that trembled slightly, her professional composure tested by the sight of the great horse lying in the ruins of the barn he had defended with his own body. The injuries were severe, she told Margaret, in a voice carefully stripped of emotion. Multiple lacerations, deep bruising, possible fractures that would require imaging to confirm. But his vital signs were stable, and his spirit, that indefinable quality that he had always set him apart, remained undiminished. He had survived the storm, just as he had survived the auction and the years of abuse and the slow deterioration of his aging body. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of veterinary visits, improvised shelter construction, and the constant vigil that Margaret maintained at Atlas's side. He could not stand at first, his injured legs unable to support his massive weight, and Margaret feared that he would never rise again. But on the fourth day, with the foals gathered around him and Margaret speaking words of encouragement that she half believed were foolish, Atlas began the laborious process of getting to his feet. It took several attempts, each one painful to watch, each failure seeming to confirm the worst fears that lurked in Margaret's heart. But finally, with a groan that seemed to come from the depths of his soul, he stood. His legs shook, his body swayed, but he stood. Lily and Sarah arrived the following week, their visit delayed by the storm, but not cancelled. When Lily saw Atlas standing in the temporary shelter that neighbors had helped construct, she broke away from her mother's hand and ran toward him with an abandon that made Margaret's heart clench with fear. But Atlas lowered his head to meet her, his muzzle touching her outstretched hands with the same gentleness he had always shown, and Lily wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered words that only he could hear. Sarah stood beside Margaret, watching the reunion through tears that neither woman attempted to hide. The story of Atlas's sacrifice during the storm spread even further than his previous fame had carried him. Newspapers across the country picked up the tale, and television crews arrived to film the great horse and the foals he had protected. Margaret allowed the attention because she understood that Atlas's story had become something larger than himself, a narrative of love and devotion that people needed to hear in a world that often seemed devoid of both. Letters and donations continued to pour in, enough to rebuild the barn and ensure that Atlas would receive the best possible care for whatever time remained to him. Winter came again, gentler this time, as if nature itself were showing mercy to the creatures who had endured its fury. Atlas's injuries healed slowly, leaving scars that mapped the sacrifice that he had made across his body like badges of honor. He moved more slowly than before, his strength diminished, but not extinguished, his presence still commanding despite the visible evidence of his mortality. The foals stayed close to him always, their devotion unwavering, their understanding of what he had done for them expressed in every moment they spent by his side. Spring returned, and with it came new life and new hope. The pastures greened, the flowers bloomed, and the world seemed to shake off the memory of the storms that had tested it. Atlas walked among the wild flowers with the foals beside him, his gait unsteady, but his eyes bright with something that Margaret could only describe as contentment. He had lived a life marked by suffering and abandonment, had known the cruelty of which humans were capable, but he had also known love in its purest form. He had given that love freely, without reservation, and had received it in return from the foals he had adopted, from the child whose hope he had rekindled, from the woman who had saved him and been saved by him in return. On a morning in late May, when the sun was warm and the air was sweet with the scent of new growth, Atlas lay down in his favorite spot beneath the old oak tree at the edge of the pasture. The foals gathered around him, hope and grace and courage, their bodies pressed against his as they had been pressed against him on that first terrible night when the storm had threatened to take everything. Margaret sat beside them, her hand resting on Atlas's neck, feeling the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, the warmth of his body, the life that still flickered within him. He closed his eyes as the sun rose higher, his great head resting on the soft grass, his family surrounding him with the love he had earned through years of devotion. And there, in the peace of that spring morning, the giant horse who had faced violent storms to protect his foals with his body took his final breath and was still. Margaret felt the moment of his passing, felt the life leave his body like a whisper carried away by the wind. And she wept for the loss of him, even as she celebrated the gift of having known him. The foals remained beside him for hours, unwilling to leave, their grief expressed in soft sounds and gentle touches that spoke of bonds that death could not sever. They had been orphans once, abandoned and alone, and Atlas had given them everything. He had given them protection and warmth and the knowledge that they were loved. He had given them a family. And though he was gone, that gift would remain with them forever. A legacy of love that would echo through every day of their lives. Atlas was buried beneath the oak tree, where he had taken his final rest, and Margaret planted flowers on his grave that bloomed every spring in colors as vibrant as his spirit had been. His story continued to touch hearts around the world, a reminder that love knows no boundaries, and that the greatest among us are often those who give everything for the ones they cherish. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe. Leave a comment telling us how it moved you and from which part of the world you are joining us. Together, we celebrate the extraordinary bonds that make life worth living.